3rd, 2009. With me is Council Member Falcone. And today we have two items on the agenda. We have the fiscal year 2009 mid-year review and the report from the Infrastructure Financing Task Force report. And Mr. Richard Jensen is here to help us with that. So we'll start with the mid-year review. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Horton and members of the committee. The mid-year report, we're going to actually be covering two things, or the purpose is twofold. First, we are going to give you our normal status of what our revenues are doing and our expenditures in relation to budget as of December 31st, 2008. But we're also going to be going over some updates to our balancing strategy for the current year. You might recall that several months ago we had talked about a $5.5 million projected deficit this year and the strategies to balance that deficit this year. We have some updated numbers, so we want to show that to you as well. So we'll be talking about, again, status of revenues and expenditures and then the rebalancing of the current year budget. And with that, what we'll start with is revenues, looking at general fund. And the normal format is we'll start with general fund, of course, revenues and expenditures, and then we'll move on to the enterprise funds. So first, looking at the non-departmental revenues, typically the tax revenues. We know you've seen these numbers pretty recently, but we just want to go through them anyway in a brief format. Starting with sales tax, you can see that we are at this point have revised our estimates to $18.9 million for the year against a budget of $20.4 million, which means that we're expecting for the remainder of the year, by the year end, about $1.5 million shortfall in sales tax revenues alone. And we are estimating that for the year we're going to realize almost an 8% decline in our sales tax revenues in relation to prior year. Property tax revenues, we get information in September, October timeframe as to what that number is. The only variable really is the amount of supplemental taxes we receive throughout the year. It's been pretty volatile over the last 5 years. It's averaged about $800,000, $900,000 in the last 5 years. We have projected conservatively about $500,000 of supplemental tax revenues this year, which would bring us to a shortfall of about $141,000 by year end. But as you can see, the growth that we're estimating, 3.2, is fairly reasonable in relation to some of the other taxes. Bed tax, this is information, or based on information through December 31st. We receive our payments, of course, 1 month in arrears. So through December 31st, we received our payments through November. And since then, we've seen the month of December go down by 11.6% and the month of January go down by 1.8%. So we're having to watch this because obviously our exposure is that it could continue to decline in double digits as it's seen in the last couple of months. But at this point, we're projecting about a 3% decline for the remainder of the year. And based on that, we're expecting TOT revenues still to fall short of budget by over $500,000. UUT revenues, utility users tax revenues, those are actually holding pretty strong. You can see that we are projecting a 4.2% growth for the entire year, which would bring us a surplus of about $164,000. All sectors, for the most part, are doing well. In particular, natural gas is up 25%. It's not a real big portion of our overall UUT revenues. It's about 10% total, but it is doing well. Again, it just fluctuates with the commodity prices. I'm hearing that for next year, that price could go down substantially. So it's a pretty volatile revenue, but for now, 25% increase through December 31st. Cable TV is up 8% roughly, as well as refuse being up about 6%. So we'll look now at some of the other non-departmental revenues. These are revenues that aren't part of the departmental fees and charges. Sure.
Sorry, Bob.
Okay.
Just the last thing you said about the refuse, and we're doing the rate study today at Council. The solid waste, or whatever we're calling it now, what are we calling it now?
Solid waste.
Solid waste. Environmental Services
Okay.
Department is an enterprise fund, yes?
It is.
So the portion of the UUT that is from refuse, solid waste, goes into the enterprise fund, yes?
No.
Aha. Would you please clarify that? Because normally enterprise funds are little businesses in and of themselves. They're little worlds. They take in the money, they create the money, they spend the money. It doesn't go anywhere. So
Right.
this is something quite different and maybe unique in the organizational structure. This
No.
is a tax from refuse, a fee on
Right.
refuse,
Right.
that has an enterprise fund associated with it.
Right.
However, this money stays in the general fund.
That's correct. And that's true of all the utilities, for example, water, wastewater, and refuse. The utility users tax revenues or charges on those utilities, all those revenues go to the general fund. And they have been, and that's very typical and normal.
Okay, so let me see if I can clarify this because it's a little confusing. You have a fee for water, for garbage, for wastewater that you pay, $34 a month or whatever it happens to be. Those are the fees that go into those enterprise funds, those specific enterprise funds. The taxes on your $34, however, stays in the general fund.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the next, again, non-departmental revenues, just some of the key ones. First, interest revenue. As you know, interest rates have been falling dramatically over the last year and a half. We're still expecting that we're going to be right at budget by year end, primarily because we haven't seen a lot of our investments mature. We're expecting over the next 18 months that as our investment securities start to mature and we're replacing them with lower yielding investments, we're going to see a material decline in our interest revenues. But
So
this
you
year,
will be dropping those projections for
yes,
next
for
year?
next year.
Yeah.
This year, actually, we would normally see a decline or a shortfall, but it's offset by some interest earnings that we have received and will be receiving on our MLAP loans, our Employee Mortgage Loan Assistance Program loans. So that's offsetting some of the shortfall we'll see this year in just from interest earned on our investments. Franchise fees, you can see that the variance at year end we're projecting is pretty much right on the dot, $58,000 under budget, but essentially it's right at budget. Property transfer fee or tax, that's the tax that's charged when there are sales or any exchange of ownership on homes. And as you know, the number of transactions of home sales is down dramatically, and you can see it's reflected in those revenue estimates. We're projecting $166,000 shortfall this year against a budget of just $500,000.
Let me go back up just a second on the franchise.
Sure.
What do the numbers look like behind that? I mean, the transactions, I should say.
Well, the franchise is in a sense similar to the utility users tax. There are different rates, but those revenues track along with utility users tax revenues. So there's cable franchise, there's telephone, etc.
But those rates have not gone down, right?
No, they're not. They're fixed.
Mm-hmm.
But just again, the revenues are driven by the amount of sales, or if you will, or service levels that are provided by those franchisees.
The function of the sales. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Ms. McLean?
Just briefly, since you had stopped him, the property transfer fees for when a house gets sold that hasn't been sold since the 60s, it gets reevaluated and comes up to market value, and there's a difference there, and so we realize money from that. The question is, though, does this lag like the information from the property taxes do, or where in real time are we with respect to our knowledge of how the market is holding up or beginning to sell again?
Right.
Are we 2 months back? Are we in real time? Where are we?
Yeah, I would say it's more real time. It's property transfer tax is a bit of a leading indicator for us.
Okay.
It tells us the number of transactions and therefore what's going to be happening to assessments. Again, I think it's real evident that the number of transactions have dropped just by virtue of this revenue decline, which means that for the future, we can expect that we're not going to be seeing as much increase in the assessed values that you would normally see with a lot of transactions and therefore reassessments of properties.
I hear from the realtors, though, that the market's beginning to turn again. It's beginning to churn, if you will,
Right.
that things are selling, things are moving.
Yeah, that's
To
true.
some extent.
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah.
Still way below previous.
But this
previous years.
doesn't lag the 2 months that our
No.
information with regard to property taxes
No, it
do.
doesn't.
That was my question. Thank
And then the vehicle license fee revenues, you can see we budgeted about $432,000. We are projecting a shortfall of just under $100,000, and this shouldn't really be a surprise. You know, these are based on the value of automobiles, and as you know, sales in autos have gone down dramatically over the last year. It's one of the sectors, in fact, that's been hit the hardest with respect to our sales tax revenues. So this is reflective of that decline in sales.
Seems to me it should be down further.
Yeah, you know, the way the VLF does work is, you know, it's based on a declining value or depreciating value of a vehicle. It's currently 0.65%. And what we're not seeing is that it's not going up as it should be, or normally like we would see when there are a lot of sales of vehicles, because obviously newer cars have a higher value. The reality, though, with VLF is that the way we are paid from the state, we have really no idea how they make those calculations. A lot of this is assumption.
Neither do they.
But it's really volatile from month to month. And so, we kind of make some guesses as to what's causing the decline. But in reality, we really don't know how the state pays us. It's a really complicated formula that they're not able to share with us.
Ms. Falcone.
And on the VLF, it's my understanding, and I don't know if it's still in there or not, but this state budget, this current budget that was just passed, evidently has a formula in it that has to do with the VLF. I understand
correct.
they're doubling, the fees are doubling.
They're going to raise it by 0.5%, so it's going to go up to 1.35, if I'm not mistaken. Somewhere around there, almost doubling, and not quite.
The numbers you're showing us today don't have those calculations
They don't.
involved, though.
Right.
Okay, so we'll hear more about it.
Right.
Thank you.
So, Jill, if you can go back to the previous slide, I just wanted to just point out the previous revenue slide. You can see, though, just for these four revenues, the variance we're expecting by the end of this year is almost $2.1 million just for those revenues. On the other revenues, it was about $300 and some thousand, so a pretty substantial shortfall this year overall that we're expecting, and we'll be talking more about how we're going to resolve that later in this presentation. So with that, what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Rudy Livingston, our accounting manager. He's going to talk about the general fund expenditures as well as enterprise funds, and then we'll get into the discussion of the recommended adjustments to balance the budget. Rudy.
Good afternoon, Chairman Horton and members of the Finance Committee. The table that you see in front of you on the screen there summarizes general fund budget and revenues through December 31st, 2008 with a comparison to the prior year. Excuse me, this one doesn't have the prior year. That was on my other slide. Yeah, it does. No. Sorry about that. That's on my other slide that I didn't put in here. Excuse me. The annual budget column that's there represents the amended budget, which includes appropriation carryovers from the prior year, as well as any supplemental appropriations approved by council in the current year. The year-to-date budget column represents 50% of the annual budget, and this coincides with 6 out of the 12 months of the fiscal year being elapsed at this point in time. Now, most of the expenditures tend to be incurred fairly evenly throughout the year, primarily due to the fact that salary and benefit costs, which make up approximately 75% of the expenditure budget, tend to follow those regular monthly patterns in there. The amended annual budget totaled approximately $110 million, with the year-to-date budget at $55.3 million. Actual expenditures of $56.7 million combined with $1.8 million in encumbrances results in an unfavorable variance of $3.2 million at mid-year. Now, encumbrances consist of amounts that are carried forward from the prior year, as well as current year contracts for materials or services, such as financial audits, maintenance contracts, professional services agreements, that will be performed throughout the remainder of this fiscal year. Most of the negative mid-year variances in the general fund are attributable to encumbrances at this point in time. If we exclude the encumbrances from the numbers, expenditures were approximately $1.4 million over the year-to-date budget at December 31st. Now, we know that the economic climate in Santa Barbara and throughout the county and that throughout the country got significantly worse in the second quarter of this last year. And as previously noted, key city revenues have been negatively impacted, and accordingly, the general fund expenditures will need to be curtailed to offset the expected revenue shortfalls. In December of last year, each general fund department was given an expenditure reduction target that they are expected to meet in the final 6 months of the year. The total of this targeted reduction is $3 million in expenditures in the general fund. Now, the annual budget has not been adjusted for this expenditure target reduction, nor has the schedule that you see in front of you. Excuse me. Now, I'm going to discuss the negative variances as they in the general fund. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I got a little froggy here.
Can I just jump in real quick?
What page are you guys going to be referring to?
I think we're just referring to what page? Yeah, hang on a second. I'll tell you what page of the schedule. It's page 6 of attachment 2 of the agenda report.
And that's a summary of expenditure schedule that we gave you in that packet.
So as Rudy indicated, our goal this year, in spite of what you're seeing up above or here on the screen, is to realize a savings this year of $3 million, and actually that number is going to be probably closer to $3.5 million. So you can see the magnitude of what we're trying to accomplish. That direction was essentially given in December, so they're having the remaining 6 months in order to turn that around. And each department has been given a share of their target, so they know what their number is, and they've actually submitted basically their respective plans, how they're going to get there. And we feel confident that they can get to that number, but you can see it's a pretty daunting task. And you'll see as we talk more about the adjustments, in large part it has to do with the fact that we're going to pick up some mutual aid revenues that are going to offset a lot of those costs in the fire department. So that number is actually a little bit exaggerated as you see it there, because it is backed up by revenues that we're going to be recognizing. But again, it's going to be a big number to achieve by the end of the year, $3.5 million savings roughly, but we believe we can get there.
Okay. The first the first department I want to discuss is the city administrator's office. In the city administrator's office, departmental expenditures were $53,000 over the year-to-date budget at mid-year, and this was attributable to approximately $83,000 in encumbrances at December 31st. These encumbrances are primarily professional service contracts for labor relations and also for Spanish translation for City TV, and these will be utilized throughout the remainder of the year as needed. The police department expenditure and encumbrances were almost $1.3 million over the year-to-date budget at December 31st. Approximately $274,000 of that is attributable to encumbrances that will be used throughout the year, and the largest of these is approximately $101,000 for the Sobering Center and the Department of Justice drug analysis, as well as over $100,000 for equipment and protective gear purchases that they anticipate this year. Salary and benefit expenditures resulted in approximately $915,000 of that budget variance. And there are a few reasons for this. First of all, as you may recall, council gave direction to the department to overhire in the first part of the year because in anticipation of several key vacancies that we knew would be happening later on in the year. So we're incurring a double salary and benefit cost to a degree for several months of the year. Additionally, we had payouts of accumulated leave time in connection with the retirement of several officers that have been with the department for a long time. And one of these will be discussed in our requested budget adjustments. They had about approximately $400,000 of additional leave balance cash outs related to those officers.
I have a question here, Rudy.
Sure.
Rudy, something you said, maybe it's just the way that you said it, but I'd like some clarification on it. It has to do with the direction that council gave to overhire. You said for the first half of the year. Am I understanding that there's some interpretation that it's just to overhire for the first part of the year, or that we gave the direction in the first part of the year to overhire for the entire year?
Yeah, let me clarify that. That's a good point.
It makes a big difference.
Council did give authority to overhire for the full throughout the year, whatever was needed.
Forever, if we have to.
Yes, but as it has occurred thus far, with the retirements that have occurred, we aren't currently in that overhire position at this point in time.
That's my understanding. I have a
Yes.
problem with that, so I hope it's rectified soon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That is the state as of December 31st, at least. And speaking with Deputy Chief Mannix, they're constantly looking into that, what they need to do, and they're making sure that they have enough staff to service the city properly.
The authority to overhire stands. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Now, getting back to the police or continuing on, one of the other reasons for this, the budget variance is the overtime costs associated with Fiesta and 4th of July in the first part of the year. So we're front-loaded significantly related to that. Now, they do anticipate that salary and benefit costs will decrease in the second half of the year. So that if, based on your comment that you just made here, that's an issue that has
I'm
to be
sorry, Rudy. I
taken
parse
up with
words
the
for a living,
department.
you know. So
Yeah. Okay. So they're going to be monitoring it, and they're striving to make sure that they're fully staffed to take care of the needs of the city. The expenditures and encumbrances in the fire department were approximately $1.1 million over the year-to-date budget at December 31st. And as Bob Samario indicated, this is primarily due to the costs of providing mutual aid assistance to jurisdictions outside of Santa Barbara County. And in fact, the total cost of providing mutual aid so far this year in overtime was approximately $1.4 million. Now, a portion of this was included in the original budget, so they're not requesting $1.4 million of additional appropriations at this time. But as Bob indicated, the city does receive mutual aid reimbursements to cover the additional direct costs that we have, as well as some overtime that is factored into that. And the overtime is a direct cost and the overhead is in addition to that. At this point in time, the department staff expects approximately $2.2 million in mutual aid reimbursements this fiscal year. And we, as one of the adjustments that we're proposing at mid-year, and we'll discuss in a few moments, they're requesting approximately $1 million in additional appropriations to fund the costs of this mutual aid.
Say that again. They're expecting
2.2
from outside sources.
Correct, $2.2 million
And then the next
total.
sentence was?
And the next, the department is requesting an additional appropriation authority of $1 million to cover the cost of the additional overtime expenditures.
Okay, but
Yes.
that isn't clear. Do you mean from the 2.2? Or
Yes.
Okay.
Is that because 1.2 is already in the budget? So the
Why wouldn't
extra
they ask
1
for
million
2?
appropriation would cover the entire 2.2 going in?
That's correct. They had budgeted approximately $750,000 roughly at the beginning of the year for these overtime costs, and what they're seeing is the additional costs here that they need to cover.
So
through
what's
this
the
additional
difference?
adjustment.
So where's the extra 500 or so thousand? Because there's the 750 plus the 1 million request for extra appropriation, which is 1.75. But you're saying there's 2.2 coming in. So there's a
That's correct.
So where's the extra
A
money?
portion of the mutual aid revenue was already budgeted at the beginning of the year. They anticipated a portion of that. So part of the $2.2 million that we're receiving was already included in the revenues in the current year budget.
On top of the 750? You said 750 was in the budget.
That was the expenditure side of things. Excuse me, I'm sorry. That was the expenditure side of things. But our revenues included a portion of the mutual aid reimbursements that we would receive this year.
I guess,
Yeah,
I guess where I want to get at the end of the day is the whole entire 2.2 million we're getting in is revenue going into the department to offset the
Right.
cost.
Yeah, recognize again, because they receive overhead in addition just to the direct cost that we incur for overtime, so we essentially make a profit. We don't need to appropriate all those revenues in order to cover our costs. So there's going to be some excess revenues that we don't need to appropriate that are going to be received and recognized in the general fund. But what we need to appropriate from all those $2.2 million in total revenues
Got it.
is that which we have in addition to what we need, basically what we need above what we already budgeted this year.
That answers the question, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. The next department I want to discuss is Parks and Recreation, where expenditures are approximately $443,000 over the year-to-date budget. This is almost entirely due to $426,000 approximately of unspent encumbrances. But it's not, in this particular department, it's not uncommon for them to have a slight negative variance at mid-year because they have a lot of classes that occur in July and August as part of their program, so they have a lot of front-loaded costs there also. They anticipate that things will generally even out throughout the remainder of the year. Community development and the library department expenditures were over budget by approximately $500,000 and $39,000 respectively. And this is entirely due to unspent encumbrances. A significant portion of the community development encumbrances are for human services grants that they program at the beginning of the year. The last section that we'll be discussing for the general fund is non-departmental. I always love this, the non-departmental department, but that's how it works out here. The non-departmental department has a $168,000 negative budget variance through the first 6 months of the year. Now, non-departmental expenditures often exceed the year-to-date budget at mid-year, primarily due to two factors. The first is that we have some debt service in there that's paid semi-annually when it's due, and so it's not a ratable expenditure. Additionally, we have an encumbrance for community promotions contracts with the Conference and Visitors Bureau, as well as some costs for Fiesta and the 4th of July that occur in that first quarter. Now, this concludes my report on the general fund expenditures, and I'd be happy to answer any further questions we have at this time before we turn to the enterprise funds.
I guess it's more of a budgeting philosophy question about the use of putting a lot of these items under encumbrances as opposed to just putting it into the budget itself in the first quarter. There's a lot of things that happen in the first quarter that we pay out right up front that's supposed to cover the entire year. So you're automatically setting ourselves up for looking like we're going beyond the budget. And you've mentioned a number of them that it should catch itself up by June 30th. I mean, the police overtime at Fiesta, all the grants that go out the first of the year for the full year. I mean, to a large degree of what's listed here. And I guess I just asked the question, is it just an accounting, make things easier that we just divide up salary and benefits, 12 equal parts, or does it make sense for that first quarter to just add things to the expense side of the line that is going to be spent in that first bit? So that way, at the 6-month review, we don't see this big gap, because I think as the public looks at this, every single year it looks like we're not making budget, when in fact there are reasons behind it. And I think how we communicate that out to the general public is important, as opposed to saying, trust us, we'll catch up by June 30th. So could you comment on that?
Committee Member Schneider, I think it's an excellent point. We do seasonally adjust the year-to-date budget number for revenues to recognize that revenues don't come in on a ratable basis or evenly throughout the year, so we adjust them to recognize that sometimes they come in earlier in the year, later in the year. So when we're comparing to actuals, it is a meaningful comparison. With expenditures, there is, as Rudy indicated, 75% of the costs are salaries and benefits, and they are incurred on a pretty even basis throughout the year. I mean, it's almost 1/12 per month. But there are departments that do have seasonal impacts on the expenditure side, and they're fewer than the majority. But like recreation, of course, they have recreation classes in the summertime, so they're going to incur more costs in the early in the year. Our non-departmental, because of all the festivals that occur in July and August, we know we're going to be showing more expense in the front of the year. So we can't really do anything to control how those expenditures come in. The one thing we can control, perhaps, is how we display the encumbrances, because a lot of those encumbrances are what are called blanket purchase orders or encumbrances. They're executed on July 1, and they're meant to be consumed over the year, and usually in a uniform manner. But when we present them here, particularly for the first quarter, it's going to show like we're way over budget, because those encumbrances are still have 3/4 of a year of value left. So, and that's why we show the encumbrances separate, and why Rudy indicated if you just ignore the encumbrances, here's where we are at mid-year, which is somewhat of a better comparison. We like to show encumbrances because it does reflect what our obligations are at a given point in time, and it does represent where we expect to be by the end of the year, in a sense, because we have to factor that in.
I'm not suggesting to ignore the encumbrances.
Right.
I guess it's just more of how you present the expenses are going to happen each and every year in the first quarter, as opposed to just dividing things up evenly every, the salaries divided by 12 per month.
There aren't that many, and it's not uniform across departments. Every department is sort of unique. So we could try to do that, but I think it would be probably add more complexity to the schedule than what we're trying to resolve.
Well, certainly. I mean, you just mentioned Parks and Rec. Most of the what it looks like they're behind their budget has to do with things that happen in the summer.
Sure, and we
so
could
police
seasonally,
in terms of
sure.
Overtime for Fiesta, which happens in the first quarter. The the non-departmental, those things get spent in the first quarter.
That's a good suggestion. I guess we can look at individual departments and say that year-to-date budget in most cases will be 50% at December, but for like library, for non-departmental parks and recreation, we can adjust that seasonally to see what's been the average of the last 3 years that's been expended that December, and then adjust that year-to-date budget column accordingly. And we can definitely look at that.
Okay, thank you.
This is a fairly common way of handling this kind of accounting procedure. It's what I'm used to. Most agencies do it this way, but
Yeah.
we could certainly see if there's another way of rationing those.
And I
out.
think one of the reasons we don't spend too much time is because in the end, we know that by year end, these departments are going to be under budget. And we will tell you when we see problems with any department where they're going to be exceeding budget by year end, and we'll at that point usually be coming with a recommended appropriation adjustment. But by and large, I can tell you that all these departments, in spite of what you're seeing, are going to be not only meeting budget, but going to be well under.
Okay.
Just,
Ms. Marconi?
yeah, just to finish up on that, I'd like to lend some support and another voice to the dilemma that we face because of these very normal accounting procedures, and everybody does it this way, and it's very accepted, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just to the untrained eye, or maybe to folks who don't quite understand how things fold in the later parts of the year, the perception is that we are operating beyond our budgetary constraints. That is something that is not true. However, you look at a page like this and you say, what do you mean it's not true? Here it is, right there, and look at it, it's over here. So it's very difficult to get the real word out and still operate under accepted accounting principles that everybody wants to continue to operate within. So it is a dilemma. I think the point is very well made. I'm not quite sure what to do about it except to keep explaining it like this. But
There is an answer to it.
there is? Okay, good. I'm glad.
What you could do without changing accounting procedures at all is simply to reflect encumbrances in a column. I mean, you already have that anyway, so you could simply print it there, and then we'd all see it, and the numbers would all be the same, but it would actually pull it out. So that might be something we could take a look at. Anyway, we do need to move along here. So.
Okay. All right, then we'll move forward to the enterprise funds. The table that you see in front of you shows the enterprise fund revenues and expenses through December 31st. The year-to-date budget for the revenues for the enterprise funds is calculated based upon a 3-year average collection rate through December 31st of each year. But the expenses shown there are only 50% of the annual budget. We haven't done an annualization on those. Now, unlike the general fund, which relies primarily on taxes to subsidize operations and programs and services, the enterprise fund operations are primarily financed from user fees. Enterprise fund revenues have not been negatively impacted by the steep decline in key tax revenues that has occurred in the general fund. However, the recession will have an impact on the enterprise funds as customers look for ways to save money in their personal budgets. We've seen this starting to occur in some of these funds. For example, the airport fund is seeing a reduction in passenger counts and also in car rentals. Downtown parking fund is experiencing a reduction in parking levels. And the rounds of golf continue to decline in the golf fund. Now, unlike the general fund, the enterprise funds were not given a reduction target for this year, but they will reduce their expenses as they need to make sure that they meet their targets for the year and they keep their budgets balanced. The expenses of all of the enterprise funds were above the year-to-date budget at December 31st, and this is almost entirely due to the encumbrance situation that we just discussed, as well as debt service payments that, as I mentioned previously, are incurred semi-annually, so you get temporary variances in there. I will now discuss some of the more significant revenue and expense variances in the enterprise funds. We'll start off with the water fund. Excuse me. At December 31st, water fund revenues were approximately $1.2 million ahead of the seasonally adjusted year-to-date budget. Sales revenue sales revenues were estimated based upon sales of approximately 14,000 acre feet of water during the year. Through December 31st, they've actually sold 8,500 acre feet. So the usage is running ahead of what was anticipated at this point in time. Annual sales will be, however, affected by the January through April rainy season. If we get more rain, then it'll bring the usage down. If we don't have any more rain, then it will continue probably at the same pace that it's at right now. Staff projections are indicating that revenues will exceed the budget at year end by approximately $500,000 to $1 million in the water fund. Downtown parking fund revenues were 45.9% of the annual budget at December 31st. And this is almost entirely due to hourly parking revenues falling well below what staff originally estimated. And this is pretty uniform across all of the parking lots that the city operates. Staff originally estimated almost 5 million hourly parking transactions for the year, but the estimate has now been revised to approximately 4.3 million transactions this year. Revenues are expected to end the year approximately $365,000 below the budget at year end. And the fund will balance its budget by deferring some of the costs that it has budgeted, primarily that has $2.9 million of capital improvements budgeted that will occur over the next several years, and they will defer some of those costs to make sure that they balance their budget for the current year. Airport fund revenues are projected to end the year approximately $194,000 under their budget. This is due to declines in both the commercial and industrial revenues as well as terminal revenues. Commercial and industrial lease revenues will be approximately 4% under the budget due to the loss of 3 tenants and also the limited ability to release those properties as a result of the economic downturn as well as some of the location of some of the properties. The terminal revenues are approximately 7.2% below budget because of a corresponding decline in passenger traffic. And this decreased passenger traffic affects food and beverage sales, gift shop revenues, as well as parking revenues. Golf fund revenues were approximately 7.4% below the 3-year average collection through December 31st. There are 2 main reasons for this. As I indicated previously, the rounds of golf that are being played has decreased, and it's down approximately 5.9% from the first 6 months of the prior year. The other reason for that is they have budgeted a $350,000 loan from the general fund for their safety improvement program, safety improvement plan, and that has not yet been funded. Now, revenues are expected to fall short of the annual budget, but expenses will be reduced to offset that revenue shortfall. At mid-year, golf fund expenses were approximately $285,000 above the year-to-date budget, and this is primarily due to the safety improvement plan where they've expended $500,000 in the first half of the year. And those costs are expended as they're needed and as the various phases of that plan occur. So we don't expect that to be a ratable cost throughout the year. Waterfront staff project a $226,000 negative revenue variance this year. This is almost entirely due to marina management revenues, and they're actually projecting that marina management revenues will be approximately $295,000 below budget at year end. This is primarily due to a steep decrease in slip transfer fee revenue. With the economy, they are not as many boats are changing hands, and the slips are not changing. And additionally, it's reflected in the percent rents that we receive from the 3 boat brokers that operate down in the marina. Now, this concludes my report on the enterprise funds.
If I could, I just talked to Scott Reedman, the business manager for the waterfront, and he indicated to me that his revised estimate just in the last couple of weeks now with respect to revenues are closer to being short $400,000 this year just because of slip transfer fees being down that much. It tracks along with home sales. People aren't able to get financing, whether it be a home or a boat, so the transactions or the sales are really down. And they budgeted this year almost $700,000. They're hoping to break $200,000 by year end. So it's a big hit. Everywhere else in the waterfront, the parking revenues are holding steady, Even the lease revenues are holding steady, and some of the restaurants, in fact, have had the best year ever this past calendar year, which is amazing, in spite of everything else that's going on in the economy. So it's really just the slip transfer fees that are down. Otherwise, their revenues are really stable.
Now, if there are no questions on enterprise funds, we'll move to the mid-year adjustments. Now, we have divided the proposed mid-year adjustments into two categories. The first one is the adjustments that were requested by the departments. The second is adjustments that are being requested as part of the fiscal year 09 budget balancing strategy. And I will discuss the first set of adjustments, and Bob Samario will discuss the second set. On the schedule that you see, we have two departments in the general fund that are requesting budget adjustments at mid-year. The first is the fire department. As I indicated earlier, they have had significant additional overtime costs to provide mutual aid. Staff is requesting $755,359 in additional appropriations for salaries to cover these costs. Staff is also requesting to reduce the budgeted appropriations for vehicle replacement costs by $131,836 to help them to balance their budget for this fiscal year. And staff is requesting an increase in budgeted intergovernmental revenues of $1,005,359 to cover all of the mutual aid costs that they have incurred.
Rudy, what is the implication of the reduction in the vehicle replacement cost?
Yeah, actually, those three adjustments there, they net $381,000. The 755, the million, the 131, the net increase or decrease in the use of fund balance. That is the fire department's share of the $3 million that we talked about earlier, their share of the $3 million savings that we're trying to generate this year. They're actually accomplishing their share through basically the recognizing revenues that they've received from mutual aid. So in their department, we're not expecting to see any material savings, and they might have some, but any material savings on expenditures, they're realizing their contribution through additional revenues through mutual aids.
What I was wondering about was the 131 doesn't imply that we're not going to buy a truck. It's
no, it's just delaying, and that's just one of the measures that they're.
That's what I was trying to get an answer to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, the funds for the trucks are actually in the vehicle replacement fund, so we actually set aside the cost for that in a separate fund. So that's not going to impact that at this point in time. It's just a delay. The police department staff is requesting an increase of $400,000 for primarily to cover the increased salary costs related to the vacation and retirement cash outs, and we discussed that a few minutes ago, and this is needed to pay for that. And those are the only two departments in the general fund that are requesting adjustments. You'll notice that the net is $18,000 reduction in reserves in the general fund. The next three requests that you see on the schedule are really related to one item, and I'm going to discuss them together with the Information Services Capital Fund, and I'll call it the IS Capital Fund because it's just too much to spit out constantly here. The IS Capital Fund has begun an infrastructure upgrade project, and the fund does not have sufficient budgeted appropriations or reserves to fund this project. So with the city administrator's approval, they're recommending that we transfer $33,000 of reserves from the City Hall allocation fund into the IS Capital Fund to assist with this project. The Information Systems Operating Fund will be transferring $55,000 into the IS Capital Fund for this project. And finally, within the IS Capital Fund itself, they're proposing to reprogram approximately $80,000 from the GIS system project to fund this project. So those all three go together there. The next one that we have is in the water fund. With the Zaka fire that we had this last year, the expenses of treating the water have increased significantly, and staff is recommending an increased appropriations of $500,000 to pay for the treatment of the water before it gets put into the city's distribution center, or distribution system, excuse me. The last two adjustments that I have we'll consider together also because they really are related to one item. You'll recall that over the last couple of years, we have had this sewer lateral rebate program in force where we assist homeowners in replacing faulty laterals in the sewer system. They have expended their full budget for that, and they need additional funds to continue on with this program. Staff is recommending that we reprogram $350,000 that is currently residing in the wastewater capital fund for their sewer overflow compliance program, and that we transfer that into the wastewater fund. So this would have the mechanics of this results in a reduction of expenses for this program, an increase of transfer expenses, and it goes over into the wastewater fund. And as you can see from the schedule, we will have an increase in expenses, but we'll also have an increase of revenues that will offset that of $350,000. So there's no net effect on reserves in that fund, either of those funds.
If I could, I know that Public Works staff is going to be before council sometime in April or May to be talking about this program because it's been a successful program, and $500,000 that they initially budgeted isn't enough, and they have a strong demand for people coming forward and wanting to participate. So in April, May, they'll be before council talking about what should we do long term. Should we increase rates? How do we fund this if we're going to go at a higher level, or do we just keep it at $500,000? So just for this year alone, they're proposing and recommending that we bump it up by $350,000 to cover the current year demand.
When we discussed this, we hoped that would be the case, actually, that people would get behind this. So if that's working that way, then that's actually a positive thing for the city.
Yeah, it just presents a long-term funding concern about how we fund an additional $350,000 each year.
Question here before we go on.
Yeah, I have no further comments on this set of adjustments, and if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll let Bob Samario proceed with his section.
Well, it's not so much a question as just a comment on the sewer lateral program, is that, yes, a long-term funding. However, at some point, if we do this right, we should run out of bad laterals. I mean, that is the ultimate goal. Now, we're not there yet, so there is, funding into the future. But if we do this right, we should, the program should extinguish itself, if you will. So.
Okay, unless there are other questions, what I'd like to do is present to you a schedule that I believe Bob Pearson actually presented to the joint meeting between the school district and city council last week. This is an updated schedule, and I want to just, first of all, you can see that the first part is just the projected deficit. It's been revised since from a couple months ago when it was about $5.5 million. And based on the information we have now, newer information, particularly with TOT and property taxes and the like, we've revised those estimates downward, so we're actually seeing a greater shortfall, or projected shortfall. I will say that sales tax revenues, we're basing that just on information through September 30. So we get the payments, 3 months in arrears, so it's payments through December, but really it's for the quarter into September 30. We won't get December's quarter until March 15th, 20th, thereabouts, and that's going to be an important one because if it's substantially down, then this would even further have further impacts on these revenues. So at this point, we're projecting about a $6.7 million projected deficit this year, and so below that, I'm going to just go through the how we're going to address that. Rudy talked about a $3 million savings that we've asked of departments. We believe that we're going to need closer to $3.5 million. In reality, we think that's going to be achievable. We've done some analysis through February, and we think that's a realistic number. It's still going to be tough, but we think it's realistic. If we're off, we're not going to be off by much. The other measures include the appropriate reserves that we actually budgeted this year for that specific purpose because we recognize that we're entering into an uncertain economic environment or time, and so we put some money aside. It turns out it wasn't enough, obviously, but it is going to help solve the problem this year. So $700,000 will be used, and essentially it's going to fall to reserves because we're not going to spend any of that. So that'll be an additional year-end variance, a favorable variance we'll realize at year-end. Initially, we were planning on bringing in $600,000 from the workers' comp fund to help as a one-time measure to help solve this problem. But since the revenues have further deteriorated, we are now recommending that we bring in $1 million, which is about half of what we believe they have in excess reserves and the portion attributable to the general fund. We've also asked ICS funds to rebate 3% this year. So the $243,000 represents 1 year's worth of charges discounted by 3%. We're also bringing in about half of what the street sweeping fund has by way of reserves. We're bringing in $500,000. And those, of course, have been accumulated over time and have been generated through parking citations in the street sweeping program. And then we're also proposing to reduce the capital program by $725,000. Actually, it's delaying certain projects, the biggest of which is, as you might remember, we've decided to postpone the financial management system replacement project until fiscal year 2011. We were planning on actually starting it next year. We did some initial work this year to do a needs assessment, but we've essentially delayed it about 18 months. And the remaining projects are detailed in the agenda report, but they're primarily related to Parks and Recreation.
We have a couple questions on that.
Sure.
Well,
I'm done.
go ahead.
Thank you. The $3.5 million, big chunk of change, just based on savings in the different departments. What part of that is due to general salary savings that we normally see each year, vacancies open, whatnot, versus actual cuts in service?
Great question. If we look at the previous 5 years and see how much do we generally realize by way of savings, just normal course of business, whether it be vacancies in positions or just because we just can't seem to spend it all, it usually averages between $1.5 to $2 million. I think the most recent year, last year, was closer to $2 million. And so when we talked about the strategy and said we initially would need $3 million, we thought what it really meant is an additional $1 million to $1.5 million on top of what we just would generate normally. So I would say that now we are talking about anywhere from $1 million to $1.5 million, almost $2 million of additional savings beyond what we normally would generate.
And normally, when we're in a regular budget cycle, when we're looking at these expenditures, the council and the finance committee get sort of a more line-by-line item of what exactly it is that's being cut in terms of to make these savings. Here, it's just as a lump sum. So, is there a chance we're going to get those kind of ideas of how things are we're going to save this extra $1.5 to $2 million in which departments? I mean, you know, we can agree to this, but without knowing the context behind where the savings is coming from, it's hard to say, is that okay to cut X
Sure.
service or Y program or
Yeah,
Z staffing position?
Committee Member Snyder, let me first answer by showing you this schedule. This is the schedule that we developed, which calculated the share of the $3 million and the allocation to each of the departments, and you can see what their share is. And, you know, with the first kind of cut, if you will, the preliminary allocation in the middle was just based on their proportionate share of the budget, but then we did some add backs of about $500,000, in fact, $500,000 adding it back to public safety. So you can see how much each department is going to be asked to cut.
You go ahead.
And in terms of the details, you know, I guess we could, if you wanted us to bring those details. Each department did submit to the city administrator and finance a memo detailing how they were going to get there. And in some cases, it was just some positions that they already had vacant that they were going to hold vacant for the remainder of the year. In some cases, it was actually making some reductions in services. But for the most part, I would say that it's primarily vacant positions that they have and some one-time measures. And so the focus is really on next year. But again, those memos were submitted and they were reviewed, and they seemed reasonable, and it seemed like they would be able to accomplish their share of the $3 million.
Okay. I mean, looking at this chart, it's basically just cutting into little pieces the same question. So if
Yes.
you look at Parks and Recreation, they're supposed to find $597,000 in savings. And again, I don't know what proportion of that is just regular savings versus actual cut in services and what kind of services we're talking about. And then to get back to what Ms. Falcone was saying earlier about police staffing, you know, if you look at the police line, where is it, $659,000, how much is that is actual, are we, you know, in terms of staffing issues, given the mandate given to council in the second half of the year. So it's kind of, I can say yes to this, but it's sort of a blind yes, if you see where I'm getting at here.
I have a problem with it as well. Last year, I think maybe a year before last, we took a look at the Parks and Rec, and we didn't want to impact after-school programs and things like that. So we made a specific case for not doing that. And when it's summarized this way, we can't really tell what's going on. So that's why there's a reluctance here to not see some more detail. I mean, we actually looked at programs within the Parks and Rec Department, as I recall, and made a specific adjustment there. And I know times are different, but still the
Sure.
point remains.
And that's a valid point, and the only thing I would say is I know that one of the things that we heard from departments was that while these numbers are fairly material this year, that they would be able to achieve these savings without any material impacts on services. And that's why administratively we felt we can just kind of deal with it and then focus really on next year where we would see some impacts to services. But this year, I think it was generally recognized that and suggested that we could achieve this. There will be maybe some impacts to services, but really minor that impacts could be next year that we're going to see to services. I think that was the basis for not bringing that kind of detail to the council or the committee.
So just to repeat what you say, somehow we're going to find $3.5 million worth of savings without really a substantial cut in services in any general fund department.
That's what I'm saying.
I have, Ms. Falcone, you have some questions?
I do.
I have some too, so go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, on the in the staff report, page 4, capital program adjustments, paragraph 1 and 2, I have some concerns about both of those, and I wanted to explore that a little bit. Item 1 is the FMS replacement. The actual quote here is FMS. It's on its last legs. And then the second item is the playground replacement program, compliance with state codes. So, question
Sure.
being, what are we
Committee
risking?
Member Horton, I'll speak to both of those. First, the FMS replacement project. We are on the last legs of our current FMS system, but I've talked with Rob Badger and Tom Doolittle from IS, and they have assured us, and in fact we talked to them before we made the decision to delay the project, they assured us that we can still work with the current system for another 2-3 years or even 4 years. We'd have to kind of keep it together, but we could do it. And so we're talking about delaying this project for essentially 1 year, and we don't think that's going to create any problems for us where we're not going to be able to have a system that's working and operational. So we don't have concerns about that issue. So the second project is it's an annual program for playground replacement or replacement. One of the reasons that we were able to reduce the funding this year and delay essentially is because we've had some monies carried over from the prior year, and combined with some of the money this year, they felt they were able to accomplish what they needed this year with minimal impacts on their program. But next year they're anticipating to have a fully funded program, and so they'll be back on track.
That's fine. I understand what you're saying, and I think maybe this loops back to the question that Helene had just a minute ago. What that really does is it focuses us on the budget discussions coming up in the next weeks and months.
That's correct.
Because how we go forward with the future will impact on this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Bob?
If I might, Bob Pearson, Finance Director. I just wanted to clarify Councilmember Schneider's question when you said that means that, are we saying that we can squeeze $3.5 million out of a budget without material impacts on services? And I think the answer to that is really, it's a yes and a no, because first of all, as Mr. Samario explained, we really naturally would say between $1.5 million and $2 million. So it's not $3.5 million. It's more like $1.5 million. Secondly, I would add that really what we're doing is cobbling together a sort of an ability to sort of limp through, if you will, this fiscal year, which is only half a year left. And I think there is a difference between a limited 6-month time frame when you're looking at something like that and cobbling it together with keeping it going than if you were to say, no, this is what it's going to be on an ongoing sustained basis. Then I think that, no, we'd be looking at different measures rather than just holding for instance, in finance, holding a position vacant that we are, and then we're looking at next year, how are we going to solve our portion of the problem on an ongoing basis. on a sustained basis. So I think it's not fair to say, and I wouldn't want people to think, because to me, if I said, well, yeah, we can save $3.5 million without an impact of services, well, why didn't we do that 10 years ago? And I don't think that that's a fair characterization, because it's really not $3.5 million. It's more like $1 million or $1.5 million. So we're talking about maybe 1% of the general fund, and for a limited window of time, which is 6 months. And so I think that needed to be clarified so that people
helps.
aren't scratching their heads saying.
And I think just to follow up, the main discussions of ongoing is going to happen in the budget in the budget period where we are going to look line by line by line by line
Absolutely.
at positions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That having been said, that we're going to go forward and cobble it together and limp through and so forth. By the time the information comes to us, I think what Helene was saying maybe needs to be front-loaded a little bit more in this particular process. And Bobby, you and I have had this conversation a month or so ago about when we get the what does it mean. You know, okay, $100,000 gets cut here, $500,000 gets cut there. What does that mean? And the what does that mean and the specifics in this particular budgetary crisis and time, I think we need to be brought into the picture a little sooner than it normally happens. Usually happens in May. I'm not quite sure. I mean, department heads have already given Jim their line by line and what does it mean, and Jim has already looked over that and given back, whatever comments he had to make. Well, it would be a shame getting down to the wire during this process, and enough of us have different ideas than maybe staff came up with. And I think to juggle that around earlier rather than later is probably only best for the process. Do you understand what I'm trying to drive at here?
Yes.
Jim, smile at me. This has to be a team effort. Do you understand? And we're the ones who are going to make the decision at the end of the day.
Yeah,
so.
but one of the challenges we have is I'm in the middle of my review of the departmental budget submissions, and that hasn't completed. And I still have another 2 or 3 weeks to go, pretty much through March. And then, and again, one of my roles is to submit to you a balanced budget, okay, and to try and do it based upon what I perceive to be what your priorities are. And it's hard. If I were to come to you right now and say, one department's proposing this, what do you think? One department's proposing this.
I don't think that's what I'm asking.
Until we get the full package together, because there are several dimensions going on. We're reviewing what the departments have submitted. In some cases, I've told the department, I don't think that will work. Go back and do another analysis. Come back with something else. We're looking at different revenue options. We're meeting with the labor associations, and we're discussing with them possible concessions that they could make. We're looking at shifts of cost to enterprise departments. And as much as we'd like to have a dialogue with you in the middle of this, we need to get our act together as a staff and do our job, which is to analyze the data. When we recommend a budget to you and you'll receive it in mid-April, we will also have options. We will say, here's what we recommend based upon your professional staff's best, professional recommendations. And if you don't like certain parts of this, here's other options you can look at. And we will provide you with revenue options, and we will provide you with expenditure options. And I think we need to do our job as much as you'd like to be engaged in the process now. But we will give you, and we'll have 2.5 months to do that. And for you to review that, we've scheduled lots of budget hearings to do that. I know the public's going to also have interest in this. They're going to have opinions about it. And I think it's really important to understand we have a very, very serious problem.
Oh, we got that.
And
I do, anyway.
We're also dealing in pretty much every alternative. We're looking at the elimination of many positions in the city, some of which we've held vacant, others which involve human beings. And we're having to tread very delicately, because once a budget gets to a certain point, then we need to inform those people that their position's also in jeopardy. You know, we've got a talented and professional workforce, and we're also trying to respect that. And so we're trying to work on all of those different fronts and then provide you something that's a well thought out set of recommendations. And I can tell you that in every department, they're still going through things. They're struggling. They're working late into the night to come up with the different options. And we recognize when we submit it to you, it'll be our best professional recommendations, but then you're going to have to make some difficult choices. But we couldn't figure out a way to how we engage you in the middle of that discussion until we get our job done.
Yeah, I know that we've talked about this before, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the work at the staff level and the figuring it out and the tweaking it and the trying to come up with all the different scenarios based on years and years of professional experience is incalculably valuable and absolutely necessary. That's not what I'm suggesting. You said one thing in what you just sort of went over, which I have no qualms with, but you said one thing that I think maybe is a place that might give some informational, some insights. You said you are going to present us with a balanced budget based on what you perceive to be our priorities and our hopes, dreams, desires, and what we think. Why would you need to perceive it if you just don't? I mean, is there a way that you can actually get more clarity? And there may be 7 different, sets of priorities and so forth, and I don't know. But there's got to be a way that you can get clearer as to what we will want to keep and what we think is maybe suspendable for a couple of years.
And part of the challenge we have is not just, for example, what's the impact of eliminating a position? And from our standpoint, what we're really looking at is what are the service impacts to the community, and how will what's being recommended affect the community. And that's what's most important, I think, in our professional standpoint. And then also balancing the various alternatives and priorities. Part of what I have to do before I give it to you is balance the different priorities. Unfortunately, most of the options we're looking at are options we don't like.
I don't think anybody's going to like them.
And so if I come to you and say, would you like us to cut these programs in Parks and Recreation, and if I do that in isolation, I know what you're going to say. No, we don't like that.
Maybe not.
Do you want us to cut hours in the library? No, that you may not like that. And I think, I guess for us, it is we're going to have to bring you what we consider a balanced approach, balance the best as we can. And different council members have different opinions about it. But I guess I view my job as a city administrator is to do a lot of that internal work and gather the professionals in the organization together and put that together. And try and also, having worked with the council, and you aren't bashful about expressing your priorities, and trying to present you something that's balanced, because I think the only way to look at this next year is going to be looking at it all together. You can't look at, in fact, we're even having our discussion internally.
No, you can't. It has to be a whole package.
We may need to look at how we present budgets to you differently this year, because you can't. None of the choices are good choices, and I go to these budget meetings with the departments and go home at night, and you're struggling because, God, I don't want to do that, and then the next week you do it again, and I think we have to get you something that's comprehensive so you can look at all of the choices, and then the alternatives that we didn't recommend, like we did last year, because there's a whole list of things that we're not recommending, and then you can say, you know what, we don't want to do these cuts over here, so pull those off the table. And then the big question is, are there any revenue opportunities in short term and long term?
As long as there's time and space for that. I know we have to move on, but thank you very much.
I think that item C on our agenda calls for approval of these adjustments.
We actually have one more slide, and I'll go real quick.
Okay.
These, as Rudy indicated earlier, we broke out the recommended adjustments to the budget between those that are just requested from the departments and those that are needed to rebalance the budget for this current year. So I'm not going to go into the details. I'll just tell you that all these adjustments are basically all the accounting entries that are required in order for us to implement the measures that were presented in the previous schedule. Again, you can see the reductions in sales tax. We want to actually adjust the budget, and this is unusual for us to actually go in and reduce revenue estimates based on what we think they're going to be at the end of the year. But we thought it made sense to let's reestablish and rebalance the budget and let's put these numbers to what we think they're going to be by year end. The only thing we are not doing in this current year in terms of the adjustments is to reflect in departmental budgets where we expect them to be by year end. That's the $3.5 or $3 million number. That's going to be that's something at the end of the year we'll see, and we're going to monitor closely to make sure that they in fact achieve that target. But this is really accounts for everything else that we've talked about in rebalancing the budget this year. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, does anyone have questions, or do you want to
I'll move
propose
approval.
a motion?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much.
All right. Now we're going to move to the second topic today, which is the Infrastructure Task Force recommendations. I think staff is going to make a presentation. Richard Jensen is here to speak to us. And would you like to proceed, Bob?
I would, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Hi again, Bob Pearson, Finance Director. And want to say that really, as you know, the Council-appointed Infrastructure Financing Task Force returned their report and recommendations a couple months ago now. And as part of that, we, staff, had committed to follow through based on their recommendations to bring these recommendations to the Finance Committee and to try to work through them in a systematic manner. And then a couple, I don't know, say maybe 3 to probably 4 or 5 weeks ago now, we brought you sort of a groupings of the task force recommendations and asked, we had a discussion over whether those groupings were appropriate, and at the end of that discussion, I think the committee felt that those groupings were adequate and would facilitate discussion of the various recommendations of the task force. And want to start out by saying that today what I'm hoping to accomplish is, not to reach any conclusions or any recommendations, but to begin the discussion over a important piece of the task force's recommendations, maybe, in my opinion, perhaps the most important recommendations to come out of the report, and that is the recommendations involving capital funding and reserve policies. And really those are the two sort of groupings that we want to be talking about. And again, no anticipation that we'll reach any conclusions today, or and simply to set the stage for the ongoing discussions of this, I've brought you a fair amount of information, which I'm hoping that you will be able to take away with you today and look at prior to the next discussion, so that you can inform yourselves of some of the industry standards and practices in the municipal government industry, if you will, of California, in terms of both capital funding and in particular on the reserve policy levels. One more comment, and that is that even before the task force had been appointed, the Finance Committee had expressed a desire to review and revisit our reserve policies, which, as you know, had been established, were established in 1995 by the City Council through the adoption of two resolutions, 95-156 and 95-157. They're both in your packet today as attachments 3 and 4. And then before that discussion began, the Infrastructure Financing Task Force concept came through, and we agreed, the committee did with staff, that it would be appropriate to defer the discussion of the reserves and give the IFT a chance to include that in their discussions, because clearly that would be part of the scope of their assignment. So that's what brings us here today.
Okay, first of all, we might want to pull the screen down. It's a different slide we're talking about now. Secondly, for those that have pulled up their report on their computers, perhaps you could tell folks what recommendations we're talking about here in terms of the numbers.
Certainly.
Because we've listed the whole package, and we're not
Yes.
going to be talking about that.
Yes, exactly. That's absolutely true, Mr. Chair. And I have actually circled the ones in my book here. Attachment 1 to the agenda report is the page from the task force report with the financing recommendations, attachment 1. And the recommendations that that I see us discussing today and over the next several meetings are recommendations 2, 3, 4, and 5. And again, to me, the description of the topics are reserve policies and capital funding levels. And then attachment 2, which is the task force's management and policy recommendations page, I think we're talking about number 4. So to me, that's the scope of what we're going to be talking about today, and I personally anticipate over the course of the next couple meetings, and maybe more, because this is clearly, in my opinion, a meaty subject, both in terms of the appropriate level of capital funding that the city should be maintaining, and secondly and separately, the appropriate level of reserves that we should have established by policy. In other words, not necessarily, I mean, we're in tough times right now, and reserves may not be at the level that we would like them to be, and I think, frankly, in these difficult economic times, that's not unexpected. But at some point, hopefully, the times are going to turn around and we're going to be back on more solid footing. And at that point, we would hopefully be able to have in place reserve policies that we think are, as an organization, and that you feel as elected officials are appropriate for the city to maintain on an ongoing basis. So
you left number 1 here. Is that because you think that the budget process is
on which one, sir?
On the first attachment 1.
Oh, yes. I mean, that to me is an operational recommendation, in that what the committee, my understanding of what the committee was recommending, and I think it's said clearly here, is that to the extent that we can achieve operational efficiencies in the operating budget, then that makes funds available for capital. And the recommendation that we would achieve 2 to 3% annually, and as I have kidded, and I think we, Mr. Chair, discussed yesterday, you and I, with the fiscal year 2010 budget, I think we're going to probably accomplish about 3 years' worth in 1 year. Unfortunately, that's not to free up funds for capital. In this case, it's to rebalance the operating budget.
Just wanted to point that out.
And it's a good point to be made, because I think that even since the committee completed its work, the economic and fiscal environment has deteriorated substantially and rapidly since that time. And I think that in many ways we are having these discussions at what would arguably be not the best of times to be considering many of these things. Nonetheless, I think these are long-term goals and plans, and I don't think that it would make any sense for us to wait until the economy and fiscal situation turns around to have these discussions. I'd like to think that we would have some decisions made in the next several months that would then be taken to council, could be in place, and when the economy turns around again, we will know where we're headed, because we will have these in place.
Okay. Did you want me to ask Mr. Jensen?
Sir, certainly, if he's got.
So, Dick, use the podium there, please.
Yeah, I'm Dick Jensen. I am the chairman of the former Task Force Infrastructure Financing Task Force, and I simply wanted to observe that it's a good thing that we're dealing with this at this moment. I was struck by your conversation earlier about the budget, that one of the surest ways of influencing the formation of the budget is to make sure that these policies are up to date. Because one of the problems you're floundering with is the fact that those two resolutions don't reflect your intent. And so you've got a situation where the council's intent is not the same as the budget that's being put together, and that's something you need to bring up to date. We pushed hard on looking for new sources of revenue, or looking for ways of operating more effectively in order to become capital self-sufficient. We ended up with the latter because we saw an environment where getting new sources of revenue was likely to be fairly difficult, and in fact our our vision was correct, if we see what's happened since our report was issued. I would simply say there's a tendency to compare with other cities, and I think that's wonderful. We certainly did it, but I think it's also important for Santa Barbara to be a leader, as it is with environmental awareness, with the 2010 challenge, so on. The city has gone way ahead of the others. So become the beacon for others to compare with rather than to simply meet the mean of the other California cities. And I think everything I've heard so far is something we can do. I'd like to make another comment about environmental awareness, however. I've heard a lot of talk about we can't afford to become environmentally self-sufficient or carbon-free. I think that's not correct. And as I've said on other occasions, it's all in how long you expect to pay off the investments you make in getting out of the oil business. And you, instead of saying 7 years to get solar panels, you say, I'll invest my capital, and capital is pretty cheap right now. For 15, you'll save the city a whole lot of money on utilities simply by adopting alternatives that require the investment of capital. So your capital investments are one of the critical things. So we're grateful for the chance we had to serve, and we're also grateful for the attention this is getting at this point in time. And we agree with the sequence of...
We have a question for you, Dick.
Thank you. Since we're looking at numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5, and given the change in the economic environment since the report came out, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what I see as a question of which to do first. And there are two major things in terms of these recommendations that I see. One is reboost our reserve fund to get it to where it needs to be and figure out what that percentage is and update the resolution. So it's not just updating the resolution, but it's actually putting money into the fund itself so it matches the resolution. But then there's also the recommendation to spend significant money, 10%, and to put 10% off the top of the general fund into a capital funding stream that you actually spend every year. And I guess my question is, over time, as we want, assuming we want to meet both of these requirements, put money into a reserve account and also spend the money, which comes first and in what order, or do you do some in one and then move on the other, or what?
You couldn't spend the 10% until you began to put the 2% into the reserve. That's the way we envisioned it. And so until you actually do number one, you can't do number two.
So just in terms of the order of, so you're saying first to replenish the reserves up to the level of which we need to define what that level is, and only until you reach that amount do you then...
No, I'd be misleading you if I said it that way. Because our idea was that you need a $10 million reserve.
Right.
And you would spend from that. You would accumulate that reserve over a period of 5 years by cutting each of those, but the operating budget, getting at least $2 million from the operating budget into that capital reserve. Now, that's a big chunk in terms of what's being said here today.
Correct.
But that was our notion, and it would provide the stream for the things that are fully unfunded. You remember, 2/3 of the general fund capital budget was totally unfunded.
Right.
Now, I don't want to make that sound critical, because we thought the fact that you were identifying the capital programs and you were putting them at the point where they could be understood and ready to go should you find a source of funds, grant funding and so on, that would be good. But as a general rule, you were stymied. And so you have to find a way to pay for those. And we thought, rather than trying to raise special tax with a levy that you'd have to go to the voters, or doing some other things, you were going to be better off to try to establish a different way of operating budget management. And I would say you could actually change the resolution, and then when you adopt the actual budget, you would say, we're adopting this budget, and we recognize at this point we're not meeting our objective in the resolution. The circumstances demand that we don't, but that it's the sort of thing that becomes an aspirational statement. And if you don't have the aspiration, you'll never have it happen.
Correct.
And I was looking at the so-called items that are submitted for the stimulus
package.
And I was troubled that there were a lot of them in there that aren't shovel-ready. And I'm told that they were supposed to be submitted whether they were shovel-ready or not. But we got a lot of capital that we could do. And so I think it's important that we get on with it.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dick. Well, let's proceed then. I have some thoughts. Would you like to?
Yeah,
lead
well,
off, or-
well, actually, what I would like to do is distribute to you, tell you about some of the paperwork I'm going to distribute to you, and I don't expect to go through it in any great detail. What I would hope is that we all might have a chance to review some of this prior to our next meeting, next topic time we discuss this topic, and that we could then go through some of the data next time and determine what we can draw from it. Because I think that, and while I completely agree with Mr. Jensen's comment that just doing what other cities do shouldn't be good enough for us. I also agree with his comment that having that context is certainly helpful in my opinion, to informing the discussion. So I've got some things, and I just sort of will describe them, and then we'll hand them out. I've got a lot of things from Moody's Investor Services, the rating service. This is a report that was issued literally about 40 days ago, dated January of 2008. So that makes it a year and 40 days ago. And it is a report called 2007 Medians for California Cities, and it gives excellent data, I believe, on financial statistics, including the ratings for these cities. These are all Moody's rated cities. And it includes the total general fund balance as a percent of revenue, the unreserved general fund balance as a percent of revenue, and it presents 4-year averages for each of these cities, including Santa Barbara. And so, if I might, Moody's, as you know, we recently went before Moody's because we needed to get a rating on our soon-to-be-issued airport bonds. And you know that also that lost my train. Okay. I know, the airport bonds. Yes, the rating of the airport bonds. And because they're general fund backed, they issued not only a rating on the airport debt, but they also re-looked at our overall city rating. And this is the one-page letter that Moody's issued at the end of December 29th, that reaffirmed our AA3 rating. And it talks about our general fund. And I'm also I'd also provided you earlier the actual airport rating, and I'm going to provide that to you electronically, where they talk about, you've had it for a while, but it was a while ago. It was back right when they issued it, and so I will bring that to you. But it talks about our reserve levels because it is a general fund backed, and I thought that this might help. This is a summary of the Moody's rating scale, so that when we say that we're AA3, you will hopefully know what it is that means and how that relates to the rest of the rating universe in terms of Moody's. Another piece of paper I have for you compares us directly as an A3 rated entity to Moody's AA3, to their AA3 standard median, and the AA2, which is the rating notch right above us, and how we compare on a number of statistics to the medians of Moody's rated cities on things like general fund balance as a percent of revenue, debt burden as a percent of assessed value. It does provide assessed value and per capita. It provides our average annual increase in full value, i.e. assessed values. A lot of good statistics, I think, that are going to, I think, provide some information. I know this is a lot of information to hand out, and that's why I'm not expecting to spend any time going over it today in any detail other than this sort of outline for you. And for people that may be watching, we can certainly get these documents up on our website so that people can have access
Yeah,
to
I
them.
think this is really good material. It needs to be out there as soon as you can get it out there, Bob.
Will they come along with a tutorial?
Well, no, probably not, unfortunately. But I volunteer to be
I'll
tutor.
be in your office.
Okay. Yes. And my expectation is we're going to go through these, not everyone in total detail, but I'm going to try to highlight for you next time. But I just thought to dump this on you today and then to dive right into the discussion might be a bit much. And not when... Right, exactly. Now, here's another one, and I like this one a lot because this is less scientific than the Moody's stuff because it was a survey that was done on our state finance officers listserv, and the question was not how much in reserves do you have in your city now, but rather, do you have a reserve policy, and if so, what is that policy? So it didn't speak to whether you're meeting the policy or not, but just what is your established policy. And as I said, this is unscientific simply because it was self-selecting. People who chose to respond to the survey, including Santa Barbara, they talk about that, about their reserve policies. So, and you also see that you can get an idea of the size of the city because we've provided both the population and their general fund operating budget amount. So,
Very good material.
and I believe that's all of the paper I have to bury you with. Yeah, I know.
So I want to just make a couple comments
Yes,
and
please.
questions, and then I don't know if we need to do anything more today. But I wanted to talk about, for example, item 2 on the list, which folks can see perhaps later on. 10% off the top general fund by FY 2012. That could very well be a good position to take, but whether 2012 is the year when we're in a decline, would be something that we could talk about. So I think that's something that I would want to talk about further. On 3, revise the requirements to 5%. Replacement value rather than book value. And that actually relates to 4 and 5 to some extent. And that's something where I think we need to have probably some information specifically from you as to what that would entail. Because just sitting here cold, replacement value sounds, that's the real number, isn't it?
It will be.
But that might be 10 times the cost. I don't have any idea.
Well, yeah, Mr. Chair, if I might, I certainly agree. There was a lot of discussion at the task force about this very issue, and I think there was a clear recognition on the part of the task force members that switching from book value, historical cost, to replacement value, clear understanding that was a significant policy shift.
So on that discussion, which I hope we can have,
Yes.
I think it's one we need to have.
I agree.
I don't know if you could either get some material that would reflect. Is anybody doing that? We have it there. Okay.
We have some information that we'll provide you.
Okay. So that would be good to have, and then maybe somebody can run a projection on what the cost would be, or maybe you already have that.
We've done that as well, with the caveat that it's an estimate only because who knows what inflation and construction costs will be for assets that might not need to be replaced for another 20 years.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then, committee, would you like to spend more time on it now, or would you like to read this and come back?
I just assume digest it and become a little more knowledgeable and get tutored and all that good
Right.
stuff.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, before you
yes.
close, there was one thing because Mr. Jensen brought it up, and I think I saw an email, and there's also been some news stories about this issue about the city applying for stimulus money for fund projects that are already in our CIP. First, I want to make it clear, we have not applied at this point for any stimulus money whatsoever. The city did respond to a U.S. Conference of Mayors survey of projects that we had in our capital project that we thought were shovel-ready or could be built within a certain period of time. And it was a survey of the types of projects. That survey is on the U.S. Conference of Mayors website, and it was also picked up by a website that's run by a private organization called stimulus.com. And I think folks have misinterpreted that we have applied for money. We fully expected, and we filled out this survey, I think it was mid-December, when there was the U.S. Conference of Mayors was lobbying for the stimulus package and to talk about the number, just the extent of infrastructure needs in the United States. We fully expected, and what's coming to bear now is that once the stimulus package was adopted by the Congress and signed into law, that there would be a series of grant applications and allocation formulas, and then we would look at each one of those categories and apply for monies that we thought where we would qualify and we would be competitive. And we in fact are doing that right now. In fact, we've got kind of a master spreadsheet that we're making of the various categories of stimulus funding, and where each department that's as appropriate is analyzing those, and we'll make applications for funding. But just so it's clear, we have not applied at this point for any stimulus money, and what was on the website and reported in the news media, indicating we had applied just was not accurate.
Thank you, Mr. Armstrong. Appreciate that. Any further comments? If not, meeting adjourned.